Hello and welcome everyone to GFI Europe's Science and Technology Focus Q&A. I'm Emily Johnson. I'm the Head of Development for GFI Europe, and I'm joined today by Dr. Stella Child, who is the Research and Grants Manager for GFI Europe, and by Seren Kell, who is our Head of SciTech. So thank you so much, Stella and Seren, for being with me today. Just in case anyone is brand new to GFI and what we do, I'll give just a brief introduction. So we are a non-profit think tank helping to build a more sustainable, secure and just food system by transforming meat production and advancing foundational open access research into alternative proteins. We work with scientists, with businesses, and with policymakers to advance plant-based and cultivated meat and fermentation. And we do all of that with a view to mitigating the climate crisis and tackling various big global challenges, in addition to that, such as food insecurity, antibiotic resistance, loss of biodiversity, pandemics, and the suffering of billions of animals. GFI is laser focused on how we can direct talent and resources to create the biggest impact possible. And I know that many of our donors are too. And especially during this time of year, the giving season, many of you like to make decisions on how to create the most impact with your donations. So it felt like the right time to open the floor to questions about our science and technology work. And we hope that it will be informative and thought-provoking to you. We source the questions in two ways, via a post on the Effective Altruism Forum and also in our GFI Europe newsletter, both in October. Thank you so much to everyone who engaged with that and sent in your questions. It was really interesting to see the areas that people were the most curious about. And most importantly, if you take away one message, it's a huge thank you to you if you donated to GFI or if you're thinking about doing so, because we're completely powered by your donations and everything that we're about to talk about is possible because of you. So now we can delve into the questions. And Seren, I wonder if we could start with you, and if you could give us a summary of what you do in GFI Europe's SciTech team. And as a team, how do you decide what to focus on?
Thank you for the question, Emily. So yeah, I'm Seren, and as Emily mentioned, I'm the head of science and technology in GFI Europe. So I guess to answer the first part of your question, so what do we do, or how do we decide what to do? It's probably worth stepping back a bit and talking about our theory of change in GFI Europe as a whole. So broadly speaking, we are starting with the position that at a minimum, alternative proteins need to compete on taste and price with conventional animal meat. And where we are right now with the market, there is still a clear technical component to actually addressing that taste and price parity. There's a lot of scientific challenges which are outstanding. And therefore, in our science and technology work, what we're really trying to do is to build a strong, open access and well-coordinated research ecosystem for alternative proteins across Europe. And you can break that down into kind of what does that mean, basically, to have a strong, well-coordinated research ecosystem. So the first of those is just having a lot of researchers. So the first kind of bucket of our work is about growing the size of the research ecosystem, so encouraging researchers from other fields with the relevant disciplines to move into working on alternative proteins, and also working to build that education and training pipeline to move new scientists into the space as well. So that's our kind of the growth portion of our work. The second of these is around research funding, which Stella is our resident expert in, and essentially our goal there is to move as much research funding into alternative protein science as possible. Funding is essentially upstream of everything, and you will not have any R&D happening unless there is public funding or philanthropic funding going in to actually support that research. And then the final bucket of our work is supporting those who are already working on alternative proteins. So that means ensuring that they're actually getting access to the research funding that does exist, that they are applying to those grants, ensuring that they have the relevant knowledge and collaborators and infrastructure that they need to actually do their research as effectively as possible, and including that ensuring that they actually have awareness of what the key research bottlenecks are. So part of our work is basically doing the analysis to outline that path to reaching taste and price parity, and then communicating that with the scientists to try and ensure that they are working on the most important research questions. In terms of our strategic process, earlier this year and towards the end of last year, as part of developing a wider strategy for our SciTech work in Europe, we essentially tried to break it down into what are the measurable things that describe whether a research ecosystem is functioning well. And so these are things like how much funding is going in, how many researchers are there already actually in the space, are they coordinating with each other, are there kind of functioning knowledge sharing mechanisms like conferences and networks and things like that for them to actually be able to share the results of what they're doing. So we broke that down and basically looked at how these different metrics of an ecosystem, a research ecosystem, how they influence one another. And essentially, when we kind of looked at, the kind of ways in which progress in one might influence the other, you kind of found 3 core leverage points or 3 key metrics where if you can boost those, then the other things are probably going to be to some extent lagging metrics that will also benefit too. And those are funding, people, and research centers. So questions around like collaboration and knowledge sharing and the size of the technical talent pipeline, those kinds of things are more likely to follow through if we can get more scientists into the space, more funding into the space, and support the development of dedicated research centers. We do try to kind of assign how the different activities that we do are likely to influence those different metrics, but it is also just worth saying as well that in our work, we are pretty willing to basically experiment and to kind of see which things work over time. And there will be certain projects or activities that we do which are kind of high risk or high reward, so to speak. And we have learned some interesting things from doing these kind of experiments. For example, different ways of reaching out to different scientists, whether you go in a kind of one-to-one way, or whether you go through certain networks and platforms and collaborating with like journals or conferences, for example, to reach lots of people, but in a much less tailored way. So we've had some interesting insights that have come out of that. I think my answer has become quite long now, so I'm going to pass it back to you, Emily, to ask the next question to Stella.
Yeah, thanks, Seren. I love that so much of that is very measurable. That feels really helpful to tracking impact generally. But I guess sort of going from that, one thing that lots of our donors wonder, Stella, is how tractable is building the scientific community, given the regulatory barriers and the uncertain political climate in Europe? Why is Europe an area of focus for GFI to build the scientific community in that context?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. And as Emily and Seren said, I'm Stella. I work as research and grants manager, and I focus on research funding in Europe. And I'll start by saying, yeah, while it's true that within Europe, alternative proteins face some opposition and a challenging regulatory situation, it's actually a very diverse and complex landscape. Some countries, including actually the European Commission on some topics, are actually extremely progressive from a global perspective. For example, Europe has been responsible for a wave of world-first national action plans and commitments to accelerate meat reduction. So that includes countries like Denmark, Finland, Germany, the Netherlands. And in some cases, there are supportive policies about implementing this that have already come out. So I'd encourage you to check out, for example, the Danish National Action Plan for Plant-Based Foods, which included a commitment towards research funding for scientists in particular. So on top of the fact that we've seen sort of national supportive countries, we also know that European consumers have been early adopters of plant-based products. So in particular, Germany, the UK, and the Netherlands, people have very high rates of consumption compared to global averages. We just recently released a report on the sales figures for European plant-based products, and that shows that plant-based food sales across 6 European countries were actually up last year. So we saw a 5.5% growth in value, and I think a 3.5% volume growth, and that's despite a very turbulent period for the food industry and like inflationary pressures. that have particularly affected plant-based foods when they're not yet at taste and price parity. So they've very much now a norm in the market. We know that 1/3 of households in Germany and the UK, for instance, bought plant-based meat alternatives at least once in the last year. And more than 1/3 of German, British, and Spanish households bought plant-based milk at least once. In terms of future products, European consumer surveys also report very high levels of willingness to try cultivated meat. So there is definitely a market here for products. Realistically, global meat demand, however, is not driven by Europe in the longer term. So per capita meat consumption in Europe is very high, but global meat demand is generally predicted to be driven by other regions of the globe. So if we put aside European meat consumption, there's also a point about alternative protein production globally and how we reach taste and price parity. So where that R&D, that research and development happens to improve these products. And this is where we come to the fact that scientifically, Europe is one of the most important global research communities. Something like 18% of the world's researchers are based in the EU. A huge proportion of the top global universities, something like 70 or 76 of the world's top 200 are based in the EU and the UK together. And Europe is responsible for over 20% of global R&D funding. So that's punching way above its weight in terms of GDP, which is more about around 14%. One report that tries to estimate how much research and development funding that needs to go into alternative proteins is the Global Innovation Needs Assessment, or GINA for short, which was released by the Climate Works Foundation and the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office in 2021, suggested that we needed a global annual investment in R&D of approximately $4.4 billion. And that's to ensure that plant-based meats, fermentation and cultivated meat technologies progress to price parity. The European contribution to that, proportionally, based on global R&D share, would be about 760 million euros, and that's an annual figure. So realistically, we're not going to meet the global total unless we have a European contribution of a huge fraction of that R&D. So that's why we focus on Europe as such a priority for our global SciTech work.
That makes a lot of sense. But as you touched on there, Stella, Europe is huge and diverse. So I'm wondering how you as a team decide which countries or which regions to most focus on in your work. Seren, you might be the best placed person to answer that question.
Sure. So one thing that we did a few years ago is basically rank all of the European countries according to a range of different factors. So how much science they tend to fund, how many researchers they already have working on alternative proteins, how good innovation and commercialization generally is in that country, things like that. So lots of things that basically spoke to the potential of those countries to lead on alternative proteins R&D funding. So this was really to think about which countries we should be targeting to try and lobby for more research funding. And so that was a really helpful exercise to help us in our funding work and also in our policy team when we're thinking about engaging with governments to try and unlock more public funding. That helped us narrow down a list of which countries to focus on for that. And so, for example, the UK, Germany, Spain came out really well in that. In our SciTech work, where we're not just focused on where are we likely to get the most research funding, but also some of those other things I described before, around building a research ecosystem, we have a slightly broader list. So the countries that are likely to either currently be leading the most on alternative protein science or in the future really could be, and there's like a feasible pathway to getting there in the short term, that's basically like your Nordic countries, so Denmark, Sweden, Finland, the DACH region, so especially Germany and Switzerland, and then also the UK, Spain, Netherlands, and Belgium, and especially the Flanders region of Belgium, where there's a lot of food innovation going on. So that's where we're looking at in terms of who are likely to be the countries that are really going to lead on driving forward the technical questions around alternative proteins. And earlier this year, we actually recruited 2 people to the science and technology team one of whom is focusing exclusively on the DACH region, so Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and then the other of whom is focusing on the Nordic countries. And they're basically trying to bring more scientists into the space, support and kind of catalyze that research ecosystem, and take these countries from already leading to really properly like leveraging their current position to be doing even more and being like world leading on alternative protein science. There are other countries in Europe where the potential is less clear in the short term in terms of how much is going on, but we would love to see far more science, and they could be doing a lot more. So France is a great example of this, I think, where as a country, if you look at any other scientific or kind of technology field, they are funding a huge amount of R&D and kind of doing a lot in the context of Europe. But in alternative proteins, we're not seeing quite as much as we are in other regions. So the Nordic countries really do punch kind of well above their weight from that perspective. Italy is a similar story where we're seeing not quite as much public research funding going to the space, but there is actually a lot of like plant-based and crop and kind of general agri-food research going on there. And we'd love to build those countries up as well so that they could start to be getting to the level of, say, a Netherlands or a UK. There would also be accessory benefits of that. So if you look at the work that, for example, our policy team is doing, if we can build up the research ecosystem in, say, Italy, that might actually be supportive for some of our policy team's work, where they're looking to try and essentially neutralize some of the more controversial or kind of tricky stances that the government is taking on things like cultivated meat regulation or plant-based labeling, say. So there are kind of there's nice crosstalk between the different parts of our work streams as well. One thing I would also say is we are publishing today, so hopefully by the time this video is out, this should be up on our website, 2 reports that we've just led in GFI Europe. So Stella authored one of these, and our colleague Dave authored the other one. And these 2 reports basically looked at, in a really kind of systematic and quantitative way, where are we at right now in terms of alternative protein science in Europe. So Stella's report looks at the last few years, which countries have been funding alternative protein science and at what level and what have they been funding, whereas Dave's report takes the complementary approach of basically looking at all of the scientific publications that have come out, and again looking at which countries, which institutions, which regions are tending to contribute, how are they starting to specialize, and that's been really great, partly because it's validated a lot of our intuitions before about which regions in Europe we should be really focusing on, and partly because it just really helps us kind of have the evidence base to bring to researchers and to funders about the current state of the ecosystem and how they can actually best support the space or best contribute to the space.
Thank you. I love that you spoke about the leverage that those new roles on our team can create, which feels really important, and also the cross benefits between our different programmatic areas that those roles and your work generally can have. So following on from that, one of the questions we have is about how you measure success. So, you know, that might look like, how do you track the research ecosystem in Europe? And really importantly, especially to many of our donors from the effective altruism community, is how do you know that you've had counterfactual impact? Can you give any examples of that?
Yeah, so in terms of tracking progress or tracking the state of the ecosystem, I mentioned earlier these kind of key features or key metrics that describe the state of the research ecosystem. So things like total funding, total networks and conferences, things like that. So we do track those in an ad hoc way to see how the trends increase over time. But often we are, apart from things like funding or numbers of researchers, where the number you're tracking is the number of the thing that you're actually interested in, we're having to take proxies. So for example, how would you measure the rate of collaboration or the rate of knowledge sharing? And you can, you know, look at numbers of publications as a proxy for, is knowledge being shared? Or you can look at kind of co-author networks to see where collaborations are happening, or the number of conferences, or the number of scientific kind of professional networks. So we're tracking things like that. And then, as I mentioned, Dave and Stella's report give us this really valuable kind of high level snapshot in time for where we are at in different countries at the quantitative level on funding and publications and researchers. So we're hoping to kind of redo those analyses in future years, so we can again look at how that deep snapshot is changing over time on, say, an annual basis. In terms of tracking counterfactual impact, this is a really interesting question, because a lot of our work in the science and technology team is about engaging with different stakeholders. So trying to move scientists into the space, or trying to encourage funders to fund more things. And it's not like we have this direct activity in and output out. Like, a lot of engagement activities tend to be cumulative, and you can't necessarily with certainty tether certain outcomes to specific inputs. And we couldn't say, I mean, it's kind of obvious to say, but we couldn't do like a randomized control trial of a year of SciTech work and see what the impact has been on the research ecosystem. So it is difficult to have like absolute certainty about what we've done and what the impact has been. But I think in a lot of our work, well, all of our work, like, there is always a very clear mechanism of impact, and we do have other anecdotal ways to kind of see that we are influencing the things that we're hoping to influence. So I can give like a few specific examples of that. Like, in conferences and things, we get a lot of feedback from people that they've moved into the space because of a GFI report, or a GFI report is what helped them understand what they should be working on. And so that's like as certain as I think you can be that our work has actually helped someone get from A to B, and that we know that there aren't alternatives to those reports out there often. That's kind of, yeah, it's very important to us that we're not duplicating things that are already out there. And I think there are also kind of clever, slightly like sneaky ways that we can dig around to also look for clues about the impact of our work. So, for example, especially in our work to mobilize funding from research funders, we will sometimes see like clues in things like the wording of specific calls, or we will know anecdotally that we were the only people in a certain workshop, let's say, who were proposing certain things, and let's say like reducing the amount of research that's going on animal feed, and defining alternative proteins as being about for human consumption, or trying to really make it clear that by alternative proteins we mean plant-based and cultivated and fermentation, and not the use of insects, for example. And we can know, based on our experience of being in the workshop, like, we were the only people really pushing for that. And if we see that reflected in the final call, then we can be like somewhat sure that we did make an influence there. And then, yeah, other times we have just seen like verbatim bits of text or wording from various reports and documents that go out into these things. And then again, we can be pretty sure that that wouldn't have been there without our work. So I guess the short answer is it's a bit of a portfolio of approaches, and unfortunately it's not a perfect science, but I think we can be pretty sure in certain instances that there really is that direct impact.
That makes a lot of sense. I like the idea of looking for those clues, and it must be very rewarding when you see them and when you have those conversations at conferences and so on. Okay, so the next questions that were sent in, I've got a couple slightly more technical ones. So the first, Stella, it'd be great if you could answer this one. So public research has the advantage of making the results accessible to everyone. At least that's how it should be, and that's definitely GFI's goal. When companies conduct research on cultivated meat and precision fermentation, how much are important research findings concealed from each other, which would slow progress down? The donor who sent in this question has said that they've heard that companies often work on such different approaches that they have little or no fear that competing companies will exploit their discoveries, and therefore they're very open with their results. So, for example, we know that Mozambique published how to avoid using FBS in their process. Is this the rule or the exception?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really interesting question. So going back to the analysis that Seren mentioned by our colleague Dave Hunt, it's suggested that when you look at the whole of the scientific literature on alternative proteins in Europe, while cultivated meat and seafood research is growing and has grown rapidly over the last 4 years, it's still really in its infancy. Like out of the top 10 publications, which have received the highest number of citations over the past 2 years, they largely don't focus on technical developments. They're mostly looking at things like consumer perception, general discussions about feasibility of cultivated meat. So we really still need more technical papers out to be released in order to help the industry come together and overcome those technological roadblocks. There's a real risk of duplication if a lot of research is happening behind closed doors. On the point about whether cultivated meat companies, what their strategies are, we do know that there are a lot of different strategies adopted by companies. So we recently updated our page on our website, the introduction to cultivated meat cell lines. And it suggested, one analysis we did suggested there was no one cell type that's winning out at the moment. That's based on a survey of companies. They use a lot of different cell lines with different levels of modification, engineering. So it will be true that some research that they perform is really specialized to their cell line type. If we look at, for instance, a downstream thing of that, like growth media components for cell lines, some of the developments in that area would be cell line specific, but we also think that there would be a lot of research that would be helpful to see that would generally advance the field. So into cheap plant hydrolysates, for example, that would satisfy the basic needs of most cell types. We think as the industry matures, it's likely that there'll be some unification of strategy. So some of the approaches that are currently being tried now maybe won't work out and some will work out better. But in the meantime, there's definitely a lot of useful field advancing research that could be done that would be helpful across the board. And we definitely also see hesitation on the part of companies to publish. So the example given here was that Mosa Meat publish technical research. When they first published, they were something of an outlier in their willingness to publish open access research. And that might be due to the fact that Mark Post, who is their CEO, and Josh Flack, who was formerly a staff scientist at Mosa, both researchers by background, and they're both among the top ranked researchers in Europe based on citations and publication volume. So there really are standouts. The rest of that list of top researchers is filled by academics at research institutions with much more typical backgrounds. There have, however, been changes over time with increasingly companies being more willing to publish. And of course, companies can publish research that is protected by IP, so they can secure the IP first and then publish. And that's still quite a helpful approach in terms of knowledge sharing. So we think it's a positive trend moving in the right direction over the last few years. There were at least 20 publications that we know of that have come from cultivated meat companies now, which is pretty good for quite a young field. In terms of how GFI works to try and get around that lack of information, as I said, one thing we've done is survey industries. So we work to anonymize data and publish those trends over time to share updates on what the sector is doing, where they're at, and what approaches seem to be working. And that can help direct academia to work on the most impactful areas that are compatible with the problems that companies and industry are genuinely struggling with. We also have our grant program. So GFI runs a globally accessible research grant program. And in that, European researchers in both academic and industry have been very successful at procuring those grants in the last few years. And we work really hard to ensure that our research grants result in open access research, but also that that the terms and conditions don't prevent industry from applying, and they still allow for the work to be commercialized. So we think it's really important that we've managed to fund industry-led research projects, and we know that they will result in publications in time.
Those were really helpful nuances. That was very interesting. Thank you. And just as a kind of follow-up question to that, is encouraging academics into spinning out effective or not?
I think it's an interesting question because a lot of the time that question of commercialization of research is seen as sort of in tension with trying to get research in the open access field, like trying to get knowledge to be shared. On top of that, Europe in particular, we know has a commercialization problem, sometimes referred to as the European paradox. So this isn't specific to alternative proteins, but it's actually true across sectors. European research results end up with far fewer companies being formed than in the US and other regions, including China. This is a European-wide technology agnostic problem. And as a result of that, we don't think it's a priority to try and address this for like tech transfer in Europe as a whole. Like, we're simply not well positioned to do something like that. But we do try and support like alternative protein academic research to commercialize through tech transfer initiatives through our support strategic initiative where we can. So while we think it's great if academics do spin out, we definitely focus more on encouraging and facilitating them to work together with existing industry and to help companies that exist right now to overcome technological roadblocks. So a lot of that involves helping them understand and target the most important problems that are being faced right now. So yeah, if industry's problem is that there's a lot of duplication, then the issue academics face and often talk to us about is really not knowing enough about what the real challenges of the industry are and where they can do the most useful research. We also help our grantees build their profile and become sort of regional champions for the field. So academics really have a unique position as trusted figures in society, and they can be an important part of gaining social acceptance for new technologies. And so we try and support researchers to become those sort of multifaceted public champions where they want to, of course.
Okay, so one of our donors sent in a very science-focused question, which was, GFI say on our website that the most urgent action is to address the high costs of recombinant proteins and growth factors. So how are these recombinant proteins used in cultivated meat, and which part of recombinant protein development is expensive, and why is that?
Yeah, really great to get such a SciTech question. Basically, in order for cells to grow, if we go back to the sort of, the basics, in order for cells to grow, they need both basic nutrients such as amino acids, sugars, various salts, as well as proteins and more complex molecules that play a specific role. So those other molecules, which can be proteins, hormones, even like lipids, are used to help the cells maintain themselves, to grow, as well as to proliferate, that is like divide or differentiate, for example, into muscle cells. So one family of these molecules are proteins called growth factors. They're essentially signaling molecules. So they tell the cell to divide and proliferate, and they're a necessary part of growing cultivated meat. All of the projected like techno-economic assessments suggest that we're going to need very large quantities of growth factors as the cultivated meat industry scales. There are also several non-growth factor proteins, so other proteins that are required for cell growth, such as albumin, that we'll also need large quantities of. So recombinant proteins refers to a process where you use a microorganism to produce a protein by overexpression in a cell. So very briefly, the DNA for the protein is inserted into the bacteria or other microbe, which then produces the protein in bulk. You then need to extract it from the cell mass, purify it from all of the other proteins that the cell has, and then dry it. So there are scaled, commercially viable processes for recombinant protein. Insulin, for one, is almost always, like, it's now produced exclusively by this method. But the price point we'll need to reach for growth factors and other cultivated meat proteins will require a significant reduction in cost. So some of these growth factors currently cost upwards of $100,000 per kilogram, which is way too expensive, even if only very small amounts are required per kilogram of cultivated meat. It simply makes the kilogram of cultivated meat too expensive. So the cost of recombinant protein production is, by most accounts, divided roughly equally into upstream processing. So that's everything associated with growing the cells and getting them to produce the protein, and downstream protein processing, which is extracting and purifying the protein from the rest of the cell. So cost savings can be found in both places. So better cellular engineering, improving the way that the cell makes the protein, increasing the yield and the titer. And also from the downstream side, reducing the number of purification steps, understanding the actual purity requirements, is the more pure you try and make the thing, the more expensive it gets, basically. So if you can reduce the purity level you're aiming for, because you don't really need it to be like pharmaceutical grade purity, then that also will help you quite a lot in managing the cost. So there are definitely opportunities for cost reduction across the whole production of recombinant proteins. And there are also other promising routes to cheaper protein production. So that might be investigating media alternatives, cell-free or plant expression systems. So that we actually have a report that investigates the cost and volumes of growth factors and recombinant protein requirements for cultivated meat that I really encourage you to check out if you want to get into the real nitty-gritty details.
So, okay, we've heard a lot about GFI Europe's SciTech work today. And we've got a lovely question, which I think kind of brings all of this really nicely together and positions us back, in this giving season. So Seren, within GFI Europe's SciTech work, what is the room for funding? And what could marginal funding for GFI Europe achieve with regard to our SciTech work?
Yes, I love this question. So I guess the short answer is we're a team of 5 people trying to build an entirely new field across an entire continent. And so on the one hand, it's just like there's a lot that we could do, which we are not currently doing because we lack the resources. And on the one hand, we really focus on doing the most useful things we can do. And so we can kind of cut through the noise a little bit. But there are really, really, really impactful things that we are not doing right now, which I wish we were. And I think we feel pretty confident that they would make a big difference. So in the funding work stream, I would love for us to be able to have more people essentially so that we engage with more funders. We've had remarkable success in our direct engagement with research funders in terms of tying that very clearly to new funding, which has been unlocked and then dispersed towards alternative proteins. I think a lot of that has been in the UK and also at the EU level, but we're basically like not touching the surface of what we could be doing with other countries, including countries which could be doing a lot and just aren't right now for reasons that are like relatively tractable. Like, they might not be aware of what the main research priorities are. They might benefit from working with GFI as a knowledge partner to design funding calls and understand how their particular country or region could specialize. So you could expand out in a pretty linear way, I think, just more people capacity to engage with the scientific research funders in some of the high priority countries, so places like Switzerland, France, Finland, let's say. Additionally, one tool that we have in our toolkit to kind of basically drag new funders into the space is offering co-funding opportunities. So this is basically where we as GFI bring a certain amount of funding and then we try and get that matched by an external funder. And obviously we try to aim for the most favorable match possible to kind of maximize the amount of funding that is non-GFI going towards science. But that's a really, really nice tool to basically like push some funders over the line to start funding alternative protein science for the first time. And that's like a one-off thing you could do with a funder, because once they've done it once and they've had success and they have, potentially new startups or publications or things that have come out of that science, that's just then like a kind of impact which carries forward in time forever, because then they're very likely to just continue doing that going forward. So we did that with EIT Food a couple of years ago. We did a co-funding campaign looking at cell culture media for cultivated meat. So going back to what Stella was saying before, but it would be amazing to have more of that available to go and bring that to other funders and kind of use it again, like as a last resort. Like if we can convince funders through other means to fund the science, then great. But it can be like a really valuable tool, and often will be the only thing that will get them to kind of take us seriously, I guess, in that interaction and to kind of really see it as like a real partnership that we're developing. Another thing I would love to see us doing more of is taking on that kind of scientific think tank role. So I mentioned earlier that part of our work is basically building that roadmap for what is required to get alternative proteins to taste and price parity. And the way in which we do that is often in the form of these analytical reports and surveys where we're basically modeling out like what needs to happen, what are the biggest price drivers or taste drivers, or for example in Europe, like, you know, if we're not going to import a load of coconut oil and soy from other parts of the world, like what actually are the crops that would make sense to use as ingredients for plant-based meat, and what volumes and what scale and environmental impact considerations and things like that. So dedicated technical experts in our team who can lead on these kinds of analyses would be brilliant, because there's just a lot of big open questions that are still somewhat unaddressed. And I think GFI is in a really unique position to kind of take the long view and actually kind of lead on doing these analyses. And then I think the final thing is more of that community building work. So I mentioned earlier that we have two colleagues, Eileen and Ismail, who are focused on the DACH region and the Nordics region to really kind of create that groundswell of scientific activity in their respective regions. But I would love for us to expand that to other parts of Europe. So the next kind of regions or countries on the list where they're doing much less than they could otherwise be doing, and we really could actually have some gains by being there to build that scientific community. Yeah, that's probably a long kind of Christmas list of requests, so I'll probably leave it there.
Thank you. No, that was great to get those very tangible examples of what extra funding could do. Thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of our list of questions. Thank you so much, Seren and Stella, for joining me for this Q&A and answering the questions so thoroughly. And big thank you to everyone who sent in those wonderful questions. I feel like I learned a lot, so I hope that you did as well. If you would like to learn more about GFI Europe's SciTech work or our other programmatic work, you can of course visit the GFI Europe website. But if you would like to discuss the impact of donating to GFI in a bit more detail, please feel free to reach out to me at europe-philanthropy@gfi.org. I would love to have that conversation with you, of course. But for now, we'll leave it there. Big thank you for listening. Thank you again, Seren and Stella, and we hope that everyone enjoys their day.